You and I use words every single day, right? We barely even think about it. But beneath the surface of the sentences we speak lies this ancient, multi-channel hardware that's literally been running for millions of years. So in this explainer, we're going to do a complete teardown of modern human conversation. We're going to peel back the layers of how we actually connect with one another. To do that, we kind of need to play evolutionary detectives for a bit, because there's this profound mystery here. How exactly did our ancestors manage complex social networks, coordinate dangerous hunts, and build early cultures for hundreds of thousands of years without ever uttering a single word? Well, the answer isn't that they were just silent. It's that they were speaking a language that simply didn't require a voice.
Think about the last time someone told you, "I'm fine," but their arms were crossed, their voice was totally flat, and they wouldn't even look you in the eye. What did you believe? The words or the body language? You trusted the body language, absolutely, every single time. And that brilliantly proves that our ancient pre-linguistic system isn't gone at all. It actively overrides our much newer spoken words.
When you look at the physical and cognitive milestones of our biological hardware, a really clear narrative emerges. Around 6 million years ago, our lineage split and intentional gestures began taking root. Then came simple tools about 2.6 million years ago, followed by complex hand axes, and eventually the actual anatomical hardware for speech in Neanderthals. Language didn't just magically appear out of thin air. It was meticulously stacked onto a physical foundation built over absolute epochs.
Long before our ancestors had words, their faces were constantly transmitting critical data. Think of them as biological broadcasts. The psychologist Paul Ekman actually mapped these human microexpressions, these tiny flickers of emotion that last less than a fifth of a second. They are universal, totally involuntary emotional leaks. A sudden look of terror or disgust could instantly signal danger across an entire camp. It coordinated group survival in a fraction of a second, and it did it without making a single sound that might attract a predator.
So, language definitely didn't start as some abstract thought floating in a void. There's this great quote from developmental psychologist Esther Thielen that hits the nail on the head. She notes that our cognition is deeply embodied. Basically, our capacity to think, and eventually to speak, originated in our physical, bodily interactions with the world around us. The way we move, the way we grasp things, how we perceive, that formed the very matrix out of which language ultimately grew. Now, researchers have done an amazing job documenting great apes using intentional gestures, like pointing to share attention or raising an arm to play. But there is a distinct limit. Take Washoe the chimpanzee, for example. Adult non-human primates just don't readily imitate complex symbolic systems the way we do. Humans develop this unique, almost obsessive capacity for over-imitation. We don't just copy the end result, we copy the specific, intricate methods. And that's what allowed us to pass down incredibly complex cultural knowledge, purely through observation and physical demonstration.
But how exactly do you get from literally miming an action to having a distinct, abstract word for it? Well, it happens through a process called conventionalization. We cross this massive gap by starting with full-body mimesis, then segmenting those motions, and finally abstracting them for speed. A perfect visual narrative of this is the American Sign Language sign for home. Originally, it was a literal pantomime of eating, touching the mouth, and sleeping, resting your head on your hand. But over time, that shrank down into just 2 quick, efficient, abstract touches on the cheek.
And here is where we hit a truly fascinating neurological twist. Broca's area in the brain is super famous for controlling language production, right? But guess what else it does? It controls the fine motor movements of your hands. This strongly suggests that Broca's area was originally a motor planning region, used for things like complex toolmaking and gesturing, which only later got conscripted into handling speech. Quite literally, the hands built the neurological road and the mouth just learned how to drive on it.
Okay, I want you to consider this massive number for a second. 1.76 million. Around 1.76 million years ago, the Acheulean hand axe showed up in the archaeological record. Now, why on earth does a stone tool matter in an explainer about language? Well, because napping this specific type of axe required planning multiple steps ahead toward a final goal that you couldn't immediately see. It demanded hierarchical, sequential cognition. And that is the exact same mental architecture required to build a sentence with recursive syntax. This brings us to a really crucial transition in our evolutionary detective story. We eventually moved from a strictly manual, hand-based gestural system to one that started heavily incorporating the face. Think about how effectively deaf individuals master lip reading, or the famous McGurk effect, where just watching someone's lips move actually changes the physical sound your brain hears. Speech didn't just suddenly replace gestures. It organically grew out of mouth movements that eventually roped in the vocal tract. And all of this evolutionary legwork leads to the ultimate superpower of human communication: modality independence. Unlike animal calls, which are biologically locked to one specific sound, human language can be swapped into entirely different channels. You can take a highly complex thought and speak it out loud, type it in an email, or express it flawlessly in sign language, and the core informational content remains exactly the same. It's incredibly versatile.
Now, while we're talking about all this, we definitely can't ignore the beat. Rhythm is a pre-linguistic tool that is so deeply embedded in our biology. When humans synchronize with each other, whether that's marching in step, drumming, or chanting, our bodies react instantly. Oxytocin levels rise, our pain thresholds actually increase, group cohesion just skyrockets. This built intense trust and signaled alliance in ancient social groups in this profound, visceral way that isolated spoken words just simply cannot achieve on their own.
Let's push this to the bleeding edge of modern neuroscience for a second, with something called the oscillatory coherence hypothesis. This theory fundamentally challenges the old idea that language is just some computer code being processed in our brains. Instead, it suggests that when you speak, your brain's rhythms literally entrain the brainwaves of the person listening to you. It creates an actual physical shared frequency between two minds. You aren't just transmitting data, you are biologically syncing with your listener. How wild is that?
To see just how deeply language physically couples us to our environment, consider this completely mind-bending difference. Most of us use relative space to navigate, right? Left, right, front, back. But speakers of Aboriginal Australian languages like Gugu Yamithir use absolute spatial references exclusively: north, south, east, west. Because their grammar demands it, these speakers develop a permanent, hyper-accurate sense of geographic orientation at all times. The language they speak fundamentally alters their cognitive perception of the physical world.
And then, we have to talk about the Piraha challenge. The Piraha people of the Amazon speak a language that notoriously lacks exact numbers, color terms, and recursive embedding, which is the ability to put clauses inside other clauses. This has sparked a massive, ongoing debate in linguistics. Is grammar actually a rigid, innate, biological universal wired into all of us? Or is it a totally flexible cultural tool that adapts entirely to the specific survival needs of a community? But before we were arguing over grammar, our ancestors were likely using sound to bridge the gaps where visual gestures just failed, like in super dense forests or the dark. We can look to modern vervet monkeys for clues here. They have a highly specific alarm system, one distinct call for eagles, another for snakes, another for leopards. These calls are what we call functionally referential. They don't just express a vague feeling of fear, they refer to a specific threat in the physical world, which prompts precise survival responses from the rest of the group. Now obviously, soft tissues like vocal cords don't fossilize, so finding the exact origin point of speech is notoriously tough, but anatomy does leave clues. The discovery of a modern-shaped hyoid bone, this tiny U-shaped bone in the throat that is absolutely crucial for speech, in Neanderthals tells us a massive story. It means the anatomical hardware required for complex, nuanced vocalization was already locked into place long before our recorded history ever began.
So the narrative of human language isn't about replacement, it's entirely about addition. We didn't trade in our nonverbal microexpressions, our posture, or our rhythm in exchange for syntax and grammar. We simply layered the spoken upgrade right on top of our ancient foundation. As a matter of fact, right now, as I'm speaking and you're listening, your brain is flawlessly running both of these incredibly complex systems simultaneously.
So, what's the core takeaway you should have from this explainer? It's this. Every conversation you have is an archaeological site. Every single time you interact with someone, you are operating a multi-channel survival system that has been endlessly refined across millions of years of evolution, from the earliest, clumsiest primate gestures all the way to the bleeding edge of recursive syntax.
And that leaves us with a final, I think, really beautiful thought to take away. Every time you offer a deliberate look across a room, a subtle shrug of your shoulders, or even a profound, heavy silence, you aren't failing to communicate. You're actually just reaching past your vocabulary, and you are speaking the absolute oldest language on Earth. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it changes the way you look at your very next conversation.